Prejudice isn't born in. Nobody, no baby ever that I've met, and I've met a lot of babies, has shown any kind of prejudice. So prejudice is something we learn. I had a very normal life. I went to public school. I had a very, very good friend right from the first grade on that wasn't Jewish, but I always knew I was Jewish because I went to a synagogue and we had services and my family was observant, so that I always knew I went to a different church, but that was the only difference that I could see, because all the other things, my likes and dislikes, were the same as my friend Lottie, and we spent a lot of time together. In the first grade we played together. From there on we did our homework together almost every day, and then as we got older and went to middle school, we started taking vacations together, and that made us even closer. And we never would have thought that the time would come when we weren't allowed to see each other anymore. I just heard the marching of big armies of people marching and demonstrating and singing and running around with flags. And in the beginning, it seemed like just a very patriotic behavior after the war, and no personal fear was felt. It wasn't until end of 1934 when new rules were made. And it started out with little things like we couldn't go to the theater, the movie, where people like to go, concerts, sport events. After 6 months, there were all of a sudden, when we walked in the park, which we often did on the way home from school, there were signs on each bench, Jews don't sit here, or no Jews allowed. And it crept in little things more and more until in 1935, we could no longer associate at all with our non-Jewish friends. After a while, we couldn't go out in recess anymore. We had to stay in the room while everybody went outside and run and played and ate their lunch outside. We had to stay indoors. And it was a complete isolation that for an early teenager was absolutely devastating. The town where I lived, which was Leipzig, Germany, in eastern Germany, had a tremendous zoo. It was the second biggest zoo in Germany. And so when I was a little girl, 3 years old, I started having a season ticket all year round in the zoo because we all loved animals. My father was a strong supporter of the zoo. And so if you're somewhere for 10 years, you know all the keepers, you know all the places to see. And it was a very nice thing. I used to go at least 3 times a week, sometimes more, because it was a walk through a park very near where I lived. And it was very pleasant. And all the keepers knew me, so every time somebody had a baby, they would say, "Do you want to see the new one?" In 1934, in the spring, a lioness had a large litter of lions, and I think 4 or 5, and it turned out that one of them, she wouldn't allow it to nurse from her. She just pushed it away all the time. And I noticed it, and I went to the keeper that I knew, and I said, "What's the matter? That baby doesn't get fed." And he said, "That's what the lion mother does when she thinks a lion isn't strong enough to survive." The man who was in charge of the zoo had a big dachshund that are the very low-legged, long-eared, floppy-eared dogs. You don't see too many here, but in Germany that was a main kind of dog. And this dog had just had puppies, so they took this dog and put it in with a lion cub, and she would feed it to let it drink from her, and they got really bonded together, just like a mother and a baby. But the lion cub kept growing and growing, and soon after a few weeks, he would play very rough with the dachshund, and one little flip with a paw would send the dog flying to the corner of the cage, and it got real rough. So after a while, they decided that was too rough, so they put the baby on a bottle. It was already very well growing by that time, and the mother dachshund was taken out. But every day, and I saw that many, many times, the dachshund would take a walk to the zoo and stand in front of the cage where the baby was, and they would make the funniest noises together. I wished I could imitate it. lion sounded more like a kitten, and the dog would bark. And it was a long conversation, and then she would trot off, and the lion would sort of sit there kind of sad. But it learned to be independent and soon learned to play with other lions too. And then all of a sudden, from one month to another, a law came out that Jewish people could no longer go to any public places, and that included the zoo. And to me, that was like the end of a life, because I had spent so much time there, and my interest and my affection was so deep in there. So the last day we were allowed to go, my father took me to say goodbye to everybody. And when we came to Lion Cup, by this time he was a good size. The keeper, who saw I was crying and everything, said, if your father has a camera with him, why don't you have a picture taken with your Lion Cup, because then you'll always remember him. And so he picked him up, and I sat on a bench, and he put the Lion Cup on my lap, and I talked to him for a while, and like I always used to, and he knew me. And then we took the picture. Well, in 1934, summer vacation came, and of course there was no place for us to go. And then all of a sudden, we had a phone call, and an aunt of my friend Lottie, the aunt lived with them, called up and said, I'm taking Lottie on a vacation in the mountains, and it's beautiful there, and we would very much like for Hilda to come with us. And there was a silence, and my mother said, well, I talked to Hilda's father about it, but we don't want you to take that chance. Isn't that very dangerous for you if they find out? She said, well, if we are willing to take the chance that the girls could spend some time together, you should be willing to send her, but discuss it. And so my mother said, but how would you get away with it? And she said, oh, there's no trouble. We're going several aunts together, and we're taking our nieces, and she'll be one of our nieces. The mountains were gorgeous, the people were nice, and I was a cousin. And that was very nice. And it showed that very sincere friends will take tremendous chances, which they did. And then when we couldn't associate anymore, and to me that was, I think the children in class could probably sympathize with that the most. We used to go every day after school on her way home. She stopped at my house because she lived a little further down than where I lived, and we used to do our homework together, and all of a sudden we couldn't do that anymore, and we realized we couldn't see each other anymore. We certainly couldn't come to each other's birthday parties, and then when confirmation came was the same thing. We knew we couldn't see each other, but we had sort of promised each other we would be at each other's confirmation. And I found out when it was, when Lottie was going to have a confirmation, and the church was in walking distance. And I told my mother, I'm going to Lottie's confirmation. She said, you can't do that. If somebody sees you, you may be arrested, and your father may be arrested, and you also, that reflects on Lottie's family. I think that's too dangerous. You can't do that. And I was a typical German child. Most of the time, whether I liked it or not, I obeyed because it was expected of me. Those were different times. And I really wrestled with myself for quite a while, but the Sunday came when the confirmation was going to take place, and it was pouring rain. And I had a long raincoat with a hood. I put on my raincoat with a hood and pulled it down all the way. And I walked down in the rain to the church. It wasn't very far. And in Germany, there's a custom that a church bell rings until the services start. So you know exactly when the bell stops ringing, that's when the service starts. So I waited outside in the rain until the church bell stopped ringing, and then I opened the door and sneaked in, snuck, and stood by the back door. And there was my Lottie together with 6 other girls in beautiful white dresses, and they were confirmed. And I saw her, and I felt so wonderful. And then the minute the service was over, I ran out of the door and ran home. And my parents were so mad at me. I was grounded for over 2 weeks, and they thought it was terrible that I'd taken that risk. And it was a risk. But when you are 14 or so, going on 15, you don't really understand all the risks, and you do what your heart tells you to do. And the nicest surprise was that a week later in my mailbox there was an envelope with a picture in it that showed Lottie in her confirmation dress, because she couldn't know that I had seen her already, and I kept it and look at it often even now. Lottie I didn't see Lottie since her confirmation, which was in spring 1935. And after the war, I wrote to the Red Cross, to the city hall in my town, to the church that she used to go to anything that I could think of, because when I wrote to her old address, the letters came back. And the Red Cross wasn't able to locate her. And then the people from my hometown, from the city hall, where I was sure they would have records, because in Germany they kept all records in triplicates, so even if one got lost, the others would have still been there. They wrote a very nasty letter back and said, haven't you ever heard of World War II? We were bombed by the enemy, and most of our records are lost. And even if we had her old address or where she might have moved to after the war, she wouldn't have the same name, because by now she's probably married and we couldn't possibly trace her. So that was the end of my investigation. But to this day, I'm still hoping for a miracle that maybe someday somebody will come from my hometown and I can say, would you go and find out for me? Because I've never forgotten her. It was a very deep friendship. Yeah. You're never too young to understand what negative attitudes will do to people. And from that time on, you should be watchful that there shouldn't be any changes. You live in a free country. This is probably the best country in the whole world, although I haven't lived everywhere, but from my experience it is. And changes can take place. At one time, Germany was a beautiful country. Russia was a more or less beautiful country. Look what happened to all these countries, because people didn't care enough to maintain their society at a certain level of broad-mindedness, probably, that's the right word. Try to get to know as many people as you can, of as many different religions, of as many different nationalities, or if you can travel, you see them in their own country, which is even more educational. And after a while you will understand that doing this, you're not losing a thing of your own identity, but you're enriched by the things that you can learn from other people and that they can learn from you. And most of all, prejudice isn't born in. Nobody, no baby ever that I've met, and I've met a lot of babies, has shown any kind of prejudice. So prejudice is something we learn. We either learn it by seeing it from our elders, or it is taught in some schools maybe, and we have to be careful that we don't indulge in that, because it's going to poison our outlook in life, and it limits our abilities, and I think it takes away some of our happiness. So I wish all of you a very happy life without any prejudice.